Christianity is about the good news, right? Everybody knows that. Well, most people know that. But even the people who know it may have very different understandings of what we mean when we say good news. There are a lot of folks that just assume it means you're not going to have your sins held against you. Well, and frankly, that's good news. Forgiveness is good news. When you're burdened with a sense of remorse, hearing that you're forgiven is terrific news. But you know, when you've just gotten a bad diagnosis, maybe it's COVID, maybe it's cancer, maybe it's some other disease that is not good news, but bad news. The good news becomes there's a treatment that can work for you. The good news is the healing itself. If you're groaning in hunger, if your stomach's rumbling, if you're wasting away from malnutrition, the good news can be a bowl of rice, can be a peanut butter sandwich. If you're lonely, the good news can come in the form of a phone call, of a friend's listening ear. If you're mourning the loss of a loved one, the mere presence of somebody who cared, sharing memories maybe with you of the person that you love and see no longer, that's good news. Jesus came to bring the good news always to the bad news of whoever's present. And Jesus sends us to be emissaries of good news in that way. In part, the story in the Gospels of Mark and Matthew of the feeding of the 5,000, those stories bear that lesson. The older version is Mark's version. And so let's just go over the outline of the story, and then I'll show you how, putting them together, we learn that the good news is always very particular. So in both cases, Jesus has gone out into the countryside, out into the wilderness, sort of into a deserted place. And folks, here he's going out there, so they follow him. And the day goes on, and the sun's starting to set. And so Jesus' friends say, look, it's time for these people to go. You know they're hungry. Send them out into the villages so they can find their own Whataburger or whatever to get their own dinner. And Jesus says, you feed them. That's what occurs in both cases. In Mark's gospel, we learn that Jesus had been teaching them all day. And in Matthew's gospel, we learn that Jesus had been curing diseases all day. And then in both cases, we hear Jesus fed them when they were hungry. I want you to listen to that. Mark tells us that Jesus gives them the wisdom they longed for. Jesus' teaching helped them to connect with the God who loves them, help them to know themselves as the beloved child of God, and help them to see their neighbor as a part of their own lives. But then when they were hungry, Jesus fed them. In both cases, that's their good news. In Matthew's gospel, we hear that they came to him with maybe leprosy, or they couldn't walk, or they couldn't hear, or they couldn't see, or perhaps some other ailment, and Jesus spent the day making them physically and perhaps psychologically and emotionally whole. And at the end of the day, everyone was hungry, and Jesus, through his followers, fed them. The good news is always the good news to very specific bad news. If I am bent low by remorse, receiving forgiveness sets me free. If I am fainting from hunger, food, a peanut butter sandwich or a bowl of rice or whatever, re-energizes me and allows me to continue to really live with purpose and vitality. The key is that Jesus knows us not as a person in general. Jesus knows each and every one of us granularly, personally. Our bad news is what Jesus comes to bring good news for. Jesus is God seeking intimacy with us, real intimacy, knowing us for who we are in the depths of our souls and in all of the circumstances of our lives. And the way Jesus comes to the brokenhearted, to the hungry, to the guilt-burdened, to the mourning, to the lonely, to those who are suffering from pain or illness, the way Jesus comes now is through you and me, through his followers. Remember what Jesus said to his followers when he told them that the people were hungry. He said, you feed them. You feed them. And then when they said, I'm not so sure I can pull that off, Jesus. I mean, all we've got is a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. Jesus said, bring them to me. In other words, Jesus said, you feed them, but you won't be alone. I'm going to be in this with you. And because I'm in this with you, remarkable and unexpected things can happen. Following Jesus is not only about hearing the good news, it's about bringing the good news. But good news is never just generic. So if we're going to be bringers of good news, we have to listen. We have to listen to our neighbor, to learn what their bad news is, so that we can be emissaries of the very specific good news that Jesus has for them.